Welcome back. Occupy protesters in Denver got more than they bargained for when they tried to take their demonstration inside the state capitol. Take a look. Police used pepper spray and rubber bullets to subdue protesters. More than 20 demonstrators were arrested last night. And that's the scene in Nashville, Tennessee. State troopers there broke out the zip ties again as Occupy protesters defied a midnight curfew for a third consecutive night. Police made several arrests at the state capitol's Legislative Plaza, but the Occupy protesters seemingly have the support of a Nashville magistrate. He's been dismissing the arrest warrants and releasing the protesters. In Oakland, California, a much larger Occupy crowd turned out last night than in some of the previous demonstrations. That's a look at the scene there last night. Some are suggesting it's a support of Iraq War veteran Scott Olson. Olson, you'll recall, suffered a cracked skull earlier this week in a face-off against the city's riot police. And in New York City, where it all began as the Occupy Wall Street movement, demonstrators are battling more against the elements these days than they are against the police, well, at least for now. On Friday, citing safety concerns, the city's fire department confiscated numerous gas generators used for heating. Protesters, of course, are questioning the timing of all of that. One of CNN's eye reporters took these pictures here as the nor'easter blew into town, dropping thick, wet snow on the Occupy encampment in Zuccotti Park. Well, it's unlikely that Scott Olson is the only veteran of the Occupy.
To see change.
Well, Occupy protesters in Denver got much more than they bargained for when they tried to take their demonstration inside the state capitol. Take a look. Police used pepper spray and rubber bullets to subdue the protesters. More than 20 demonstrators were arrested last night. In Oakland, California, a much larger Occupy crowd turned out last night than some of the previous demonstrations. Some are suggesting it's in support of Iraq War veteran Scott Olson. You'll recall that Olson suffered a cracked skull earlier this week in a face-off against city police. To politics now, in a dead heat in the first presidential.
Jim, thanks very much. The storm could bring a chill to those Occupy Wall Street protests at the same time that demonstrators in some cities are feeling the heat from the police. We asked Michelle Miller to check on the protest in the New York City park where it all started.
We need a big donation of long johns.
Blankets, shoes.
Protesters are bracing themselves for the first cold snap of their 6-week demonstration. Jeff Smith has been at the Occupy Wall Street protest in Manhattan since the beginning.
The cold weather will, in some ways, help us, find out who's actually serious about this movement.
Ellis Roberts has been here for a month.
Sleeping bags are illegal in the park, so if they enforce that, we're going to cut armholes in them and call them jackets.
The cold is just one of a growing list of problems for the Occupy movement.
The whole world is watching.
Dozens were arrested as protester camps were cleared in Nashville and San Diego. Both cities cited rising police overtime costs and concerns about sanitation and safety. Protesters in New York took cell phone video as the fire department confiscated their 6 generators, pulling the plug on lights, hot plates, cell phone chargers, and laptops. But Stacy Sortzatsos hopes the inconveniences keep coming.
Just when things started getting better, we had the situation with the Occupy Wall Street happen, which actually killed our business.
Her sandwich shop is across the street from the Occupy Wall Street camp.
How much of your business has dropped off?
I have to say 40%.
40%?
Yes.
Nearly half?
Nearly half.
The key, if the snow does fall tonight, will be to stay dry. They have tarps to shield them from the rain and precipitation, pallets to raise them off the cold, wet concrete, lots and lots of blankets. Their sleeping arrangements will be huddled close together, 6 people deep. Michelle Miller, CBS News, Lower Manhattan.
One of the loudest protests against the status quo is coming from Republican presidential candidate Herman Cain, and it's taken him to the top of the poll.
A threat of gang violence, a weekend known for rioting, plus Occupy protesters on campus combined for a perfect storm of potential chaos in Eugene.
Occupy Eugene moved to university property last night and will be camped there at least through the weekend.
KVAL's Katie Boer is in the studio to explain how school officials are handling the crowd of protesters.
Well, Dave and Jen, the university is working with the protesters, even providing lights, porta potties, and fencing at campus-owned spots near the mill race. At the same time, they've emailed students warning them to be on guard about visitors on campus. Now, the email asks students to walk in pairs, avoid arguing with protesters, carry a flashlight at night, and stay in well-lit areas. But most students told us those are precautions they take anyways.
I wasn't scared. I was a little cautious when I heard they were coming on campus when they were out in the quad. Knowing that DPS and Eugene police have moved them so quickly, they've been able to contain the crowds. I don't feel unsafe.
I personally agree with what they're doing. I mean, I'm part of the 99%.
However, not everyone is happy Occupy is on campus. A parent emailed KVAL angry that her student at the U of O may be put at risk because of protesters. Another viewer asked if the cost of hosting Occupy will be passed on to students. We asked how much dealing with Occupy is costing the university. Spokesman Phil Weiler says they are still completing the total cost. The university told me today the protesters can stay in the mill race until Monday. After that, they need to move.
Well, the school
across the country and a lot of Americans who are sympathetic to this Occupy Wall Street protest movement are tonight rallying around a 24-year-old Iraq War veteran who was seriously injured during a violent confrontation with police in Oakland, California on Tuesday. Our report tonight from NBC's Miguel Almaguer.
In Oakland Tuesday, 24-year-old Marine Scott Olson was hit by what witnesses say was a police projectile. Friends rushed to his aid.
We asked him his name multiple times.
What's your name? What's your name?
He wasn't responding, so we took him to the medic.
Olson, who survived 2 tours of duty in Iraq, was critically injured with a fractured skull.
I was shocked that in this country they would do that to a peaceful protester. Scott was out here protesting peacefully.
Oakland police tactics have come under scrutiny.
We want to make sure there's a thorough and complete job and a complete comprehensive review is done of the incident.
Like other veterans and thousands of protesters, friends of Olson say he was demonstrating against a wide range of issues.
He's just expressing his First Amendment right and his conviction that the corporate greed and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan need to come to an end.
Now Olson's story is rallying Occupy protesters across the country.
March with Oakland! March with Oakland!
In New York, they shouted Oakland as hundreds marched to City Hall. From Portland to Los Angeles.
Scott Olson is a hero for standing with the people.
Tonight in many cities, the Occupy movement appears energized.
Scott Olson's family arrived here in the Bay Area from Wisconsin to good news. He's been upgraded to fair condition. Meantime, the demonstrators say they plan to go nowhere here in San Francisco. They'll hold a vigil for Olson later on tonight. Brian?
Miguel, it's bracing to hear that call for a medic here in the States for a guy who survived combat overseas. Miguel Almaguer in the Bay Area tonight. Thanks. That protest slogan from the 60s.
Very much. And today's rally on Wall Street probably won't soothe. It could even intensify the Occupy Wall Street movement that has spread across so much of the country. And tonight, one young man has become a symbol of their resolve. A 24-year-old Iraq War veteran, now in serious condition in a California hospital, his skull fractured after a violent run-in with police. ABC's Abby Boudreau has more.
With tensions mounting daily, the name Scott Olson has become a national rallying cry for Occupy Wall Street. Olson, who had joined protesters after work, was injured Tuesday night as police began firing tear gas during the Oakland crackdown. People who came to his aid were then scattered by a gas canister tossed by police. Last night in New York, protesters marched in solidarity with Olson, leading to a tense confrontation with police and 10 arrests. Today, the police union said it had shown restraint, but would now sue any protester who injured an officer. That's because an estimated 70,000 people nationwide have joined in demonstrations since last weekend. Atlanta's mayor.
We know for a fact that we have crossed the $300,000 threshold in terms of dollars spent.
Across the country, the costs are soaring. In New York City, overtime expenses $3.4 million, $2 million in Boston and counting. In Minneapolis, the sheriff's department reports spending $200,000 so far. And in San Francisco, the bill is more than $100,000. And Deborah, who's been out of a job for 2 years, says she's not budging.
How long do you plan on staying here in a tent?
As long as I have to. I don't plan on leaving unless I'm forced or I'm taken to jail.
And not far from any of their minds, Scott Olson, giving them a whole new reason to fight. Abby Boudreau, ABC News, San Francisco.
Now to an ABC.
Moved again, this time to the University of Oregon. KVAL's Ty Steele is live on the U of O campus with more on this latest move. Ty?
Dave, Jen, the protesters here say this is another temporary move. But while they're here, they plan on tackling some more issues on their agenda, namely the rising cost of college tuition and the privatization of public education. The first Occupy Eugene protesters showed up in downtown Eugene, but moved to Alton Baker Park to make way for Saturday market. After 5 nights in the park, the city gave them permission to stay until mid-December. Occupy Eugene has turned that offer down. Now they're looking for a more permanent spot and say the university just makes sense for the interim.
Will we get incredible amounts of exposure from being at the campus because there's thousands of people down there every day, but we would also like to be able to build more solidarity with the students.
The school sent out a letter to students and faculty this afternoon notifying them about Occupy. In the letter, the school says the U of O supports the right to free speech and encourages the active exchange of ideas. But the letter goes on to say the U of O cannot accommodate a campground. The University of Oregon says they do not allow camping on campus, but they say they will work with occupiers and the city to come up with a more permanent solution for the group. Now, the city and the University of Oregon is in a meeting right now deciding on what they're going to do and if they're going to allow protesters to stay here overnight. Live at the University of Oregon, I'm Ty Steele, KVAL News.
Tonight, student debt is one of the big concerns of the Occupy Wall Street protest movement. And in Oakland, California, 85 people were arrested yesterday morning when police evicted them. Some were complaining about what they said were heavy-handed tactics used by police, who used tear gas and fired beanbag rounds into the crowd during the pre-dawn raid. Later in the day, things got even worse. Our own Miguel Almaguer is standing by in Oakland for us tonight. Miguel, good evening.
Brian, good evening. Oakland is relatively quiet tonight so far. The plaza behind me has been home to demonstrators who have been protesting against corporate greed and other issues for the last 2 weeks. But last night, that protest came to an end after protesters and police squared off.
Mayhem, violence, and blood spilled onto Oakland streets. Occupy Oakland protesters and police faced off for 6 hours. This after an early morning raid by hundreds of police officers forced nearly 300 demonstrators from their Occupy Oakland camp.
What this is a gathering of working people trying to reverse a situation that has occurred that has kicked them out of their homes.
Tear gas was volleyed into the air.
They just started shooting off. And then after even the fact that everybody left, they kept shooting.
As police say, rocks, bottles, even small explosives were thrown at them. More than 100 were arrested as the late-night crowd swelled to nearly 1,000.
The decision to move was based on public health and safety due to defecation, fire hazards, sexual assault incidents, violent behavior, and the denial of access of medical aid.
Oakland wasn't the only city trying to move out protesters. Across the country, in Atlanta, police in riot gear arrested 50 overnight. In Denver, occupiers were digging in. Even snow and the threat of hypothermia didn't deter demonstrators there.